Hi everyone, this is Ian Pitino. For this episode, I will give you an overview and share the highlights of our climate and disaster risk assessment, at least the compilation of our climate and disaster risk assessment for the city of Oroquieta. I was engaged by the local government of Oroquieta in November 2023, 2022, around that time, for their sectoral studies and special area studies, or volume 3 of the comprehensive damage plan. Included in this is the climate and disaster risk assessment, which I am in charge of compiling. I work with their GIS specialist in the completion of this, as I try to make sense of the exposure database that they have developed for the climate and disaster risk assessment. So I will not delve into the deep step-by-step process of the CDRA in this episode. I hope I can do it in another episode, but I think one thing that I want to address here is the difficulty really of and technical complexity really of creating the climate and disaster risk assessment. As a GIS, as someone who has a background in geographic information systems, I am able to understand how map overlays can help determine the decision areas that are that should be concerned for the local government units. Precisely, these decision areas are those areas that have either high risk, high vulnerability, or high number of people that who are exposed to the different hazards in the local government unit. Uh, for a background, our current guidelines from the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development on Climate and Disaster Risk Assessment more often inclined to include hydrometeorological hazards such as flooding, landslides, and storm surges. I have seen a few climate disaster risk assessments that include earthquakes, liquefaction, and other geological hazards. But even even fewer have sea level rise as their part of their climate and disaster risk assessment. The climate and disaster risk assessment is complex because of the overlay not only of hazard and exposure, but most of all vulnerability. And to top it off, risk is the end goal, or the computation of risk is the end goal. So when we say risk is the probability of damage or probability of loss of life and damage. So this complicates things because you need to quantify the probability that exposed unit or something that exists on the ground, may it be population, urban use, natural resource based areas, critical facilities, and lifeline utilities, the 5 exposure groups that the guidelines prescribe for local government units to include in their exposure databases. These 5 are evaluated or assessed until the risk level. That is, risk is the function of severity of consequence and likelihood tolerance. The severity of consequence is the function of vulnerability and exposure to hazard. See, I'm just narrating the process to you, but it's already complicated. What more if it's the GIS specialist or the local government unit that is doing the surveying? one of the papers that always come to mind when I think about the CDRA or climate change and disaster risk reduction for LGUs in general is the paper by one Dr. Pulhin on how the CDRA may be improved, CDRA process may be improved. One of the key recommendations that they have, I'll put the link on the description of this episode, is that the national government should take the burden of automating or providing the climate and disaster risk assessments to the local government units, and uh, just delegate the local government just delegate to the local government units the interpretation and the contextualization of these assessments. In short, the national government, given its resource base, not only in terms of money but also in expertise, should only give the maps, the risk maps at that, and also the risk tables to the local government units. There are twofold concerns of this, at least in my opinion. First is that the different local governments would need differential treatments in terms of their context, in terms of the priorities, may it be urban or in terms of those that are not in the urban centers, the rural areas or the protected areas. And I believe it's uh, also switches, or it's also opposite the trust for local governments to become more autonomous. However, I also see the wisdom from this paper of Dr. Colhin, because like what Plan Smart or GeoRisk Philippines is attempting to do for using its Plan Smart application. Disclaimer, I am a consultant for this application. They are trying to automate the process of overlaying and also creating the plans for the local disaster rehabilitation and recovery plan through automation of the technical writing and also the repetitive tasks of overlaying maps and computing for percentages of exposed elements, or uh, actually uh, computing the rankings or based on a certain criteria of the uh, exposure and also the vulnerability of the different uh, areas of the local government unit. So, in short, the SIDRA process is really tedious, and in terms of our experience, or at least my experience in engaging with the city government of Oroquieta, they have SIDRA right now, the table, but uh, I believe the process has been too tedious because of the requirements for manpower, for actual surveys, which would take time, and also the duplication of some information and data that they get for SIDRA, which they should have gotten already through the community-based monitoring system, which Dr. Pulhin and other literature also suggest or recommend to be integrated into the SIDRA. So in short, there are literature that recommend the integration of the community-based monitoring system and the climate and disaster risk assessment process, so that the surveys that are collected, or the data that are collected through CBMS surveys, are also considered and used for the climate and disaster risk assessment, particularly those of household profiles, uh, land use profiles, and also the distribution profiles of critical facilities, agricultural areas, even roads, and other infrastructure. So, in short, this episode I shared some of my insights on how the CDRA process is complex. I hope in the next episode I can share the uh, ways to help our CDRA preparers and the local government unit itself create um, climate and disaster risk assessments quicker, but also not sacrificing accuracy and precision. Thank you.